Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It is once again me, Zach, here today with another tier list for you guys, specifically covering weapons in the funny dwarf game Deep Rock Galactic. Each class in Deep Rock has 3 primaries and 3 secondaries, and all of them are pretty good. Before we even start on the tier list, I want to note here that I consider all weapons in Deep Rock to be usable. You can win missions on any has difficulty with any weapon, given you are good enough at the video game, obviously. But I think that every weapon kind of has a niche playstyle that makes it pretty good. There are maybe some exceptions here and there at certain has levels, but once we start getting into the weeds of anything above like has 6x2, I think we're getting a little bit ridiculous. So for the purposes of this video, we're aiming pretty much between hazards 4 and high 5 plus, right? Like has 5.5 or has 5 with a bunch of the vanilla modifiers, you know, no mods required, that kind of ballpark area, right? And in addition, I have to stress here that I am aware that many of these weapons are radically different in terms of where they might go in this list, based off of overclocks, but we aren't talking about overclocks here, or at least not exclusively. I will be making an overclock tier list, probably not next, but the tier list after the next one, which is going to be a bit of a surprise for you guys, is going to be the overclock tier list, and it's going to probably be a pretty massive undertaking, because overclocks often radically alter how weapons kind of function and what they do. So we're not going to worry too much about that right now, but I will be noting when a weapon has a particular overclock that makes it good. Or, I will at the very least note if a weapon is kind of weak on its own, but becomes notably stronger with overclocks, like to a massive degree. Okay? So kind of keep all that stuff in mind. This tier list is not going to be perfect, and I do have to clarify, you can take anything, you can beat any difficulty, you know, just hashtag get good, I guess. But let's get into it, and as we do, don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe if you guys are enjoying these tier list videos, because they are fun to make, and I hope you guys do enjoy them. But let's actually get started with the driller, specifically the CRISPR flamethrower. This will come as very little surprise to anybody, but it is, I would say, best in slot for the driller. It does everything that the other 2 weapons do, such as area denial or crowd control, but it does it attached to one of the most consistent damage types in the game, that being fire or heat, both really, which will spread between enemies. You can attach slowing and fear effects to the CRISPR flamethrower without overclocks. That's just built into its baseline mod list, basically. Which means you can occasionally fear enemies who are on fire back into their, well, team. Back into the swarm. Glyphids don't really have a team, but you know what I mean. Back into the swarm, thereby lighting their allies on fire. Meaning, very strong. In addition, it synergizes well with a lot of other playstyles. Fire is a very good damage source to have, and even other classes can benefit heavily from it. I won't go into a ton of details here, but just know it's great for your team. The most notable pair of overclocks, I think, are the Sticky Flame overclock, which is the most obvious one. Everybody kind of knows about it, which it basically allows the CRISPR to have the best overall crowd control and area denial of the 3 driller primaries, even better than the sludge pump, which is just a wee bit ridiculous, I would say. Sticky Flame has long been kind of the best playstyle, somewhat unfortunately, but I don't really know how they could tweak it at this point. We'll talk about the overclock more when we actually get to the overclock tier list. The other overclock that is at least interesting for the flamethrower is... it's not on the wiki for some reason, which is, well, it wasn't on one of the wikis, which is kind of upsetting. But the newest overclock, which I'm looking up the name for you guys. Crisper. There it is. Scorching Tide. Jesus Christ, that was way harder than it needed to be. So, Scorching Tide is the newest overclock. I don't know for sure, personally, how good it is. The only reason I'm noting it here on the weapon tier list is because it does radically change the way the flamethrower can be used. It allows the flamethrower to have some burst damage tied to it. So if your complaint with the flamethrower was that it doesn't have enough big kaboom damage, that overclock might be for you. And that's the kind of flexibility that the flamethrower has, just kind of built into itself, right? Overclock wise, I don't think there's a ton of healthy options for it, but certainly it's quite good on its own baseline. You'll never go into a mission and be like, ah, goddamn, I wish I didn't have the flamethrower. You're much more likely to feel the other way with the other primaries. But none of them are bad. And going into the next one, we've got what I consider to be the most mid option. The cryo cannon has a couple of problems. One, it applies the freeze status effect, which is very strong, don't get me wrong. But the problem is that fire is a lot more common throughout everybody's kits, right? Things like the PGL, the coil gun, even the breach cutter, the shard diffractor. You've got even just built into your own stuff. The EPC has some fire mods for itself. The minigun has Burning Hell. Bulldog has volatile bullets. Like, there's a whole bunch of different play styles that are kind of themed around fire, and that want enemies to be on fire. Incendiary grenades, even. So that kind of conflicts with the I want to freeze thing play style. And while you can definitely build around it, I already would consider the cryo cannon to be a little bit more niche if the rest of the team has to kind of think about it whenever you're playing it, right? In addition to that, the cryo cannon can be either low damage or low ammo, and kind of, it feels like you're always either running out of ammunition or you are not killing stuff fast enough. It's not terrible, I want to make that very clear. It still wipes out swarms of grunts no problem, and it synergizes pretty well with the secondaries that the gunner has, allowing you to kind of 1-2 punch enemies. But it does kind of make more work for your team because they sort of have to pick up the slack of actually killing the stuff that you've frozen. I do not think it is bad. I have to make that clear. It does have a couple of advantages over the flamethrower, such as being pretty effective against flying enemies. If they do run up into like mid-range on you, you can freeze them and frozen flying enemies instantly die, right? So that's pretty cool. They can be used to stop the bulk detonator from destroying terrain. If you freeze them at just the right moment as they die, that can be kind of fun. A couple of the overclocks, I would consider the two most notable to be crystal nucleation. I think crystal nucleation, that's what it's called, right? Yeah. Is the newest overclock for it, and it kind of gives it a sticky flames build, but what are people calling it? Sticky ice build, I think. It basically does that, which gives the cryo cannon a lot more area denial and crowd control compared to what it had in the past, which is quite good because, again, it was sort of being outshone by the flamethrower in that department, and this should be the crowd control option. Now it sort of is if you play around with that style. However, I would argue that the other overclock, Snowball, still has a really solid place in any kind of high-hazard playstyle, because Snowball lets you, at long range, freeze enemies, as well as flying enemies who would otherwise be out of your effective cryo cannon range. So, still quite good, mind you, very powerful. It is nice to be able to freeze enemies because obviously your entire team will do more damage to them. And even if you freeze something and then your team hits it with fire and thaws it, it will temp shock and deal a bit of bonus damage there. Which is, yeah, pretty good. It is a solid option for sure. It is just, I think, a little bit more niche than the other two. The most mid option, as you can, well, sorry, not mid, but the most middle of the road for these three weapons option is the Sludge Pump, which goes in Great Alternative. Sludge Pump, in terms of strengths, definitely has some of the best crowd control and area denial built in, like with no overclocks or anything. It doesn't have the fear plus slow that the flamethrower has, but you can basically triple down on the slow effect and enemies just don't move after a point. It does pretty decent damage as long as enemies kind of remain in the goo. And it synergizes pretty well with, at the very least, the Sabata and the Wave Cooker with certain builds, but also has some notable synergies with Burning Hell on the EPC, which is quite good. In addition, the Plasma, good lord, this is the Plasma thingy. The Sludge Pump is also able to be it encourages synergy with the rest of your team. That sentence got away from me, apologies. Your team can light the sludge on fire, and it can save a lot of ammunition for your team if they see that a bunch of weak enemies are walking into the goo, and they know, I don't have to shoot at that thing anymore, right? The downsides of the goo compared to the flamethrower are you can sweep the flamethrower over any kind of terrain and it will just leave flame on it, right? The goo is a little bit weirder, and it won't stick to certain things. For instance, any kind of dwarf mage structure like the Minehead or the Drillivator, anything like that, doesn't stick to Dottie. It will just disappear if you hit those structures with the goo. You kind of have to keep the goo away from whatever point of interest you're hanging out near. Otherwise, you may end up inadvertently wasting goo, and nobody wants to waste goo. So, it's good. It's very solid. It kind of has some, I would say, almost boring overclocks. There aren't a ton that really stand out, in my opinion. The combustive goo mix that has just been released is interesting. I don't know if it's any good yet, but it has some cool synergies. I think most people run Disperser Compound, though, which is kind of not boring, but is just like make the sludge pump more sludge pumpier. It doesn't have a lot of game-altering overclocks in the same way that are competitive with like the base weapon itself, if that makes sense. Overall, I think that the sludge pump is a great option. It's actually the one that I use most of the time. I'm not a huge flamethrower guy, and I've only recently come around to cryo cannon with the crystal nucleation overclock, or nucleation, however you want to say it. But next up, Sabuda. The Sabuda has widely been considered one of the worst guns in this video game, but it was tweaked a while back, and while I think most people still consider it a little bit on the weak side, it's certainly usable. I am going to put it in the kind of mid alternative because it's still just not incredible. It doesn't blow me away. It has some good uses. It can occasionally be good for taking out targets that are further away that the driller would otherwise struggle to deal with his primaries, and it has some cool synergies specifically with the sludge pump, with one of the new mods that was added into it. Let me double check on the name here for you guys. It's the... Okay, I've found a much better wiki, and I found the name of the mod. It is Neurocorrosive Toxic Catalyst, which is a lot of words, but the point is, the Sabata is at least reasonably usable now, and has good synergy with the sludge pump, has okay synergy with the flamethrower, and some with the cryo cannon as well. I think blow-through rounds is good with the cryo cannon. I don't remember offhand, but either way, Sabata, it's a little bit on the weak side. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but I don't think it's so bad that it is unusable now. I think sometimes people kind of dunk on it unfairly at this point. Even if it's a little bit weak, it has some niche uses, and a lot of people seem to enjoy it as just a reliable offhand. Next up, though, we do have the EPC, the Experimental Plasma Charger. And that goes straight up in best in slot. This will probably surprise absolutely nobody. The main reason it's up here is the mod that it has called Thin Containment Field, which is extremely powerful, great against flying enemies, lets you mine minerals and stuff. It's really good. It's a very flexible weapon that has utility and combat potential. And any weapon that combines both of these things is automatically great. It's part of the reason why all three of the Driller's primaries are so good, is just because they are damage and also utility. So, EPC, top of the line. Not a whole lot to say about it. There are probably thousands of videos about the EPC and how good it is. Just go watch almost literally any random, like, has 6x2 lobby, and the Driller is probably running this. It's great. It's solid. Does good work. It has some other builds you can do. Some people do take Burning Nightmare instead of Thin Containment Field. Especially with the sludge pump, because you can light your sludge on fire, which is fun and cool. But it's not a must pick. Some people will act like it is. There are decent alternatives. But it should be noted, I think, that part of the reason people think the Sabata is so weak is because the EPC is so strong. It's just so wildly overshadowed that it can be a little bit painful. In terms of notable overclocks, I didn't really cover this with Sabata because I don't even know if I should bother mentioning this outside of the overclock video. For the Sabata, I think that the most notable one is the explosive reload overclock, which seems actually pretty good, all things considered. I think most of the explosive reload overclocks are good, and Sabata is no exception. With EPC, the most notable for me, in terms of personal preference, is the Lingering Plasma overclock, which just, I mean, it insta-kills babies, pretty much. So you slap that bad boy down in any kind of choke point, and even if you're looking at, like, Nada sites or something, they'll all float into the plasma field and die, and it's great. So next up, we have the Wave Cooker. The Colette Wave Cooker, even. This is obviously the great alternative option here. Wave Cooker has really solid synergies with all three of the big boys. The downside of the Wave Cooker is that by itself it just doesn't do very much damage. It's kind of weak. If you pull it out because you are running low on ammo for your big guys, it's kind of disappointing. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it does have some nice utility. First off, it can synergize with these, like I said, very directly. It has mods that cause enemies to freeze or burn faster. It has mods that auto temp shock enemies or cause them to explode. All kinds of stuff. But the other bit of utility it has that is interesting is because it is a weird kind of cone-shaped hit scan weapon, it is very easy to kill flying Nada sites with it or swarms of babies at long range, and can also be used to check the cave roof for things like cave leeches and such. Which, you know, again, it doesn't do a ton of damage or anything, but it will clear out some of those nuisance enemies that might otherwise be annoying to deal with once they get to close range. I like running the Wave Cooker with the Cryo Cannon and the Sludge Pump. Not as big a fan with the Flamethrower, but I usually run the Blistering Necrosis overclock, which my friends and I affectionately refer to as the Cancer Cannon, because it is great. Auto, like, basically spawning weak points on enemies for your team to pop. That's great. That's 10 out of 10 weapon design right there. Overall, though, it is outshone by the EPC in a lot of situations, and I don't think it's too far off the Sabata. I think, generally speaking, all three of the Driller's secondaries are kind of weak, but that is because their primaries are so incredibly powerful. But, moving right along here, time for the Warthog, the shotgun, the Big Daddy. Alright? The Warthog is my favorite engineer primary, and it goes straight into the great alternative. Warthog has a couple of flaws and a handful of strengths. The two big flaws that I would want to point out here are that there's only one Tier 5 mod for the Warthog, and that is Turret Whip. Minor adjustments, which competes with Turret Whip, is just objectively not as good. And I don't like saying that. I think that Turret Whip probably should have just been made baseline to the weapon, because it is core to how the gun functions. And I realize that this is probably an unpopular opinion, because based off of a lot of videos I've seen on YouTube of people talking about the Warthog, people do not like Turret Whip, and they do not like having to be by their turrets for more than half a second at a time. They want to run and gun to the other side of the cave as quickly as possible. And like, I don't know, dude, maybe play Scout? I'm sorry. Like, you're engineer, stick by your turrets, you know? I don't know. It's probably a personal preference thing, but I really like the playstyle that Turret Whip kind of engenders with the shotgun. And if they don't want to make Turret Whip necessary, buff minor adjustments, add something else to it. It seems like the most recent overclock, pump action, was sort of an attempt to make the Warthog a little bit more of a typical shotgun in a typical first-person shooter, and make you a little bit more independent of your turrets. But I don't know how effective it has been at that, because we already had a few overclocks that were along those lines. The other weakness of the Warthog, though, is that much like most of Engineer's primaries, it's kind of on the weak side, right? Engineer's kind of the inverse of the Driller. The Driller has really powerful primaries, kind of weak secondaries. The Engineer has kind of weak primaries and very powerful secondaries, right? So, as a self-defense tool, as a get off of me, don't touch me, I hate you button, the shotgun is very good. As a crowd-clearing machine, it's not so good. And I think that's intentional, and that's fine. Again, the newest overclock, the pump action one, is probably what you want to go for if you really want to stick to your guns here about the Warthog being your primary weapon and being what you use to clear out groups of bugs. But that being said, it's quite good. Notable overclocks outside of that freebie I just gave you talking about the new one. Magnetic pellet alignment basically turns your shotgun into a sniper rifle that allows you to peel enemies off of the ceiling and hit enemies in their weak points for a ridiculous amount of damage from almost any range, which is fantastic. The other one is actually a clean overclock, Stunner, which is great if you are worried about bugs running up on you a lot. If you're playing at really high hazard levels where bugs move at the speed of a fighter jet, this can be helpful because you just kind of fire randomly into the swarm and you probably stun everything that you hit. But I personally lean towards magnetic pellet alignment because it feels so good to just snipe something off a wall from the other side of the room. Now moving right along to the Stubby. Stubby is going to go down here in mid alternative. Stubby is pretty good. Stubby's biggest weakness is that before you get overclocks, it kind of is donkey doo-doo. It's just not very good. It's not unusably bad, to be clear here, but it feels bad to use it before overclocks. And, like, you might be saying, well, duh, obviously if you go into a Has-5 mission with no overclocks, you're going to have a harder time. And yeah, I would expect a harder time, but not necessarily a less fun time, you know what I mean? Stubby is just a little bit weak without overclocks, is what I'm saying. It's still quite good, and it has, at this point, a lot of good overclocks. I'm not going to list them all here, but I will note that the newest addition to its overclocks, which is not really a newest addition, I guess I should clarify, they reworked Turret Arc and turned it into Microconductor Add-on, which is a great area denial and crowd control tool. Up until this season, most people have run Turret EM Discharge, which allows you to shoot your turrets and they explode an aura of lightning around them, which is just fantastic, just really solid, very, very, very strong. I don't know if that will change at all, with the new overclock. I find myself running the new overclock on every stubby build currently, but you know, that might be personal bias. Either way, it's a very solid um, gun to kind of build around. Electricity or the lightning debuff is a little bit of a weak status effect. You know, we've talked about the goo, we've talked about fire, we've talked about ice. We haven't really talked about electricity because there aren't a ton of really good builds that kind of work around it. There's a few, but the Stubby's variants of it are all pretty strong. You can build the Stubby to be more of a typical SMG, not really focused on the lightning element, just do bullet damage instead, and it's fine as well. We're not going to go any deeper into it though, because I will get bogged down talking about different builds for the Engineer for hours, and that's not what you're here for right now. But, maybe in the future? Maybe. Next up is the Lock, and that is obviously best in slot. The Lock is kind of an interesting case because I would argue that the Lock and Stubby are both very weak before overclocks compared to the Warthog. I think that the Warthog with Turret Whip is stronger with no overclocks than either of these two other weapons, but once these two get their overclocks, they kind of maybe don't leave the Warthog behind, but Stubby gets to be about even with it, and the Lock is, I think, superior to it, which is a bummer, but the Lock is an interesting gun across the board because it shoots, well, it doesn't shoot, it aims for you. You simply lock onto enemies and then it puts bullets into them. No reason to think at all. In addition to being pretty easy to use once you get the hang of it, it has multiple really powerful overclocks. The most notable two, in my opinion, would be explosive chemical rounds, which is great for clearing out swarms. Actually makes the Lock into more of a typical primary, where you find yourself reaching for this instead of your secondary a lot of the time, which is always nice because, you know, weak-ish primaries. And the other really solid overclock option is Executioner, which is just really good at killing one thing super hard. Both of them are great, and the Lock in general is great. Lock's good on any mission type, and excels at long range as well as mid range, and is even pretty okay at short range, though by that point you're probably going to want to whip out one of these bad boys, one of your primary, or your secondaries, sorry, to help defend yourself. I don't have much else to say about the Lock, except that it's really good, and if you haven't tried it, do try it. Take a few missions to get used to it, because once you get the hang of it, it is really fun. Next up, straight into the secondaries of the Engineer, and we are starting with the PGL, my beloved, my favorite secondary of the Engineer. And this bad boy goes right here at the bottom. The PGL is in a bit of a rough spot, in my opinion. It is a powerful, flexible tool that is very solid, and there are plenty of people who would give their right leg to switch out one of their secondaries for a PGL. Imagine a driller who could ditch the Sabata and replace it with a PGL. That driller would kill men for that privilege, right? Objectively. The problem is that the PGL competes with these other two guys, and it lacks some of their flexibility. The biggest bonus of the PGL, my favorite element of it, is, and this is going to sound kind of weird, but wall bugs. Wall and ceiling bugs, specifically. In most rooms, the PGL has no issue hitting the ceiling of a room, and also hitting most walls of a room. And unlike the Breach Cutter, which fires in a straight line, and the Shard Diffractor, which fires in a straight line, the PGL, with its weird arc and big AoE impact, can hit on a wall and deal damage basically in a big circle around it. Meaning everybody gets hurt, everybody's on fire, everybody takes damage, and it's awesome. However, when fighting in a straightaway, especially when you are on the same kind of plane as the bugs, the other two options just do better. PGL, you'll end up hitting yourself sometimes if you're not careful. In addition, PGL suffers a little bit from some kind of mediocre overclocks. It gets stronger with overclocks, obviously, but Two of its overclocks hyper-focus it in ways that aren't entirely healthy for the weapon itself, and most of its other overclocks are mediocre to bad. It has a very strong standout overclock in the form of RJ250 compound, which gives you the capability to TF2 rocket jump all the time, which is great. It has a pretty small weakness, only reducing your area damage a little bit, and gives you 70% more ammo, no big deal. This is obviously awesome, and makes the PGL not just usable, but actually quite good. The problem is, as I said, we gotta now talk about the Breach Cutter. Breach Cutter is best in slot for engineers, secondary. I am a long-term Breach Cutter unenjoyer. I don't hate it, it's just not my favorite weapon to use. But it is impossible to deny how powerful the Breach Cutter is. It does so much damage so consistently, and one of the weaknesses of the engineer class is that if bugs get right up on you, you don't have a good option for clearing out a large number of them, right? For self-defense, your primaries do just fine, but if more than like 3 bugs are on you, it can be a problem. If you're using the PGL or the Shard Diffractor, your options are basically back up and reposition, or try and kill your way through but take some damage, just kind of depending on your preference. With the Breach Cutter, you don't have that decision to make, because you turn, you see 15 bugs on top of you, all of a sudden you go, haha, Bert, and then you hit the fire button, and everything dies, all of it, instantly. And if it doesn't die, it's probably stunned, and if it isn't stunned, then it explodes. Like, everything dies, all the time. Breach Cutter kills, that's what it do. It's so good that a lot of people just run clean overclocks on it. Notably, roll control, which was reworked a little while ago to allow you to kind of aim the weapon after you fire it and causes it to spin in the air. It's pretty good. Like, for a clean overclock, there's not a ton of those that I would say are worth taking, but that's definitely one of them. Very powerful. The other big option for overclocks on the Breach Cutter is Inferno. It's one that a lot of people really enjoy. It's pretty solid. It cuts your armor breaking a little bit, but lights things on fire. It's nice. Nice to have. Overall, though, you could just run the Breach Cutter on any difficulty with no overclocks, and you'd probably be fine. It's literally that strong. And if you are going to run one, you can literally just grab the, what's it called here? Lightweight cases, which just gives you 3 more ammo and reduces your reload time. You could just run that, and you would do completely fine. It is literally that strong. Is it the strongest gun in the game? No. But when it comes to the engineer, it's your go-to. If you're struggling on higher difficulties, this is a good crutch to learn how to play with, because you can't be out of position if everything is dead. Overall, though, it's best in slot, but gotta throw this out there. Shard Diffractor is a very solid alternative. I think that obviously all weapons are usable to one extent or another, but Shard Diffractor has, I think, some very interesting build capabilities. It has a lot that you can do with it that makes it fun and exciting. The most notable one, this is one of those weapons that's not really defined by a specific overclock, but is shaped, like public perception at higher HAS levels is kind of shaped by an overclock, and it's Volatile Impact Reactor. It basically gives you a slightly weaker version of Sticky Flames, but attached to a weapon that does crazy high single target damage as well. It's very good. Has a lot of synergy with, Sludge Pump. You can light enemies on fire and they light the sludge on fire. It synergizes just fine with Flamethrower, because then you're just doubling up on the Sticky Flames, which is toxic and funny. Has some synergy with some gunner builds. It's great. Overall, big fan. I will also note, however, Plascrete Catalyst is kind of fun. If you haven't fucked around with Plasticrete Catalyst, go and try it out. I'm not going to explain anything here. I'm going to send you in blind. Just go and figure it out. It's fun. It's weird, but it's fun. Overall, though, I think Shard Diffractor is definitely a weapon that you can take in place of the Breach Cutter, and you won't feel like you're missing out on that kind of solid self-defense option. PGL I don't think is as good at self-defense, but if you take RJ250 Compound, you can rocket jump, and repositioning is basically a form of self-defense, so it's quite good. Next up, we've got the Gunner, though. Gunner is, I think Gunner was actually my least played class there for a little while, because all of my friends really like Gunner a lot. But let's talk about the Gunner's weapons, and there's going to be some controversy here a little bit in this one, because overclocks just deeply shape how the Gunner's everything goes. But I am going to say that the Leadstorm powered minigun is best in slot, and I can hear the screaming in the comments. I know that Neurotoxin payload and the new rocket overclock are both really, really good, but hear me out. The reason I'm putting the minigun in best in slot is because something has to go up there, and all of the Gunner's primaries are really good. But minigun is, to me, the most flexible option. You just don't really leave yourself open to too many weaknesses when you are playing with Leadstorm. It has several very, very good overclocks. It has reasonable build diversity because of that. You can take, for instance, Burning Hell, which is my personal favorite. That's what it's called, right? Yeah, Burning Hell. I always get that wrong for some reason, and I second guess myself a lot. You have Bullet Hell as well, which is quite good. Leadstorm is situationally good, and even the a little more oomph clean overclock is pretty solid, like surprisingly quite good. I wouldn't take it on Has 5 and above too much. I have, but I wouldn't anymore. But that's because I'm a giant Burning Hell simp and I'm not afraid to admit it. Overall, Leadstorm is mostly up here because it is so flexible. It is just really good in any mission type against pretty much any enemy. You just don't have a ton of weaknesses with it. Next up, we got the autocannon. Now, I think the autocannon is in kind of a weird spot. I would say that it is the mid alternative. Now, again, I can hear the screaming, okay? I know. Neurotoxin payload and the new mortar rounds are really fun and seem quite good. But hear me out. The autocannon is in kind of this weird spot that I would sort of compare to the PGL in a way, where whenever you pick an overclock for it, it radically alters what the autocannon does to the point where it becomes kind of specialized into one thing. And it's just kind of meh at those things. Now again, Neurotoxin payload is really powerful, and if we were talking purely about Neurotoxin, it would be best in slot. But we're not just talking about it, we're talking about the weapon as a whole, and I think the autocannon is overall kind of mid. It's not bad, but until the mortar rounds overclock came out, I pretty much never used it personally. I would only ever use Neurotoxin payload, and I just didn't care about any of the other stuff it could do. Now I have mortar rounds and Neurotoxin to fall back on, and I like that. Overall, it's not a bad gun by any stretch of the imagination. I think Big Bertha is usable, and I mean, that's it, really. I think if Carpet Bomber were buffed a little bit, this weapon would move up a tier, frankly. But as is, I just have never been all that impressed by the autocannon. I don't hate it, but outside of very specific builds, I don't love it either. Next up, we've got the Hurricane, and as you can already tell, it's going smack into the great alternative. The Hurricane is weird because by default, you can kind of aim the little rockets that it shoots out and kill people with them, which is cool. But the weirdness, I think, puts a lot of people off, and it can feel a little bit less effective against certain types of enemies that are really far away. There's a travel time to the rockets that don't exist really, or that doesn't exist really with the minigun, being a hit scan weapon, and even sometimes the autocannon. Overall, it's still quite good, but what I think saves the Hurricane from being down in mid is the overclocks that it has access to. Because the new cluster charges overclock is considered by many people to be the strongest overclock in the game, period, full stop, end of sentence. But Hurricane also has the mine layer system, which has historically been one of its best overclocks, and even the plasma burster missiles are niche and pretty useful. It's an interesting gun that I have not played around with nearly enough. But when I have played around with some of the stronger builds for it, it's felt really good in a way that autocannon just kind of didn't outside of neurotoxin and recently mortar rounds. So it's close. All three of these are great, and none of them are bad. I really have to stress this. We are talking about tiny, tiny degrees of separation between these three on this tier list. This is not as big a gap as Breach Cutter versus the other secondaries of the Engineer. But, moving right along, let's talk about the Bulldog. Bulldog is the best in slot. Bulldog is great. I love the Bulldog. Bulldog has several builds that are quite good for it, and it has a lot of flexibility in how you can use it. It's great at dealing with enemies that are, that have big exposed weak points but are high value targets, like Mactera and stuff. It also is pretty good against basically anything if you take, what is the overclock called? Volatile bullets, because it deals 300% damage to burning targets. And it should be noted that with at least one of your primaries, you can apply the burning status on your own, and you also have a grenade that does it. It is very good. Some of the other overclocks are also quite solid. I ran magic bullets for a while. I thought it was pretty cool. But overall, Bulldog is just good by itself, independent of overclocks, and that's what puts it so high, in my opinion. Whenever I don't have the Bulldog, I miss having the Bulldog. That being said, though, we do still have the Burt, and the Burt I'm going to put in mid. I think the Burt is okay. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. And I think that the reason why it is not great, and what keeps it from being as good as it could be, is that it kind of feels like it doesn't have an identity. Both of the other secondaries that the gunner has, as spoilers for the coil gun, both of them excel at killing targets that have, high value but exposed weak points. Mactera of varying kinds, goo bombers, even certain other things, like if you are killing a brood nexus or something, they both can do pretty good damage against it. The Burt is almost more like a little SMG in a weird kind of way. Sorry, I'm pointing at the wrong one. The Burt. It's not that it's bad, it's just that it's not what the gunner needs most of the time, You often will end up feeling like you're either not doing enough damage or you're blowing through ammo a lot of the time. And it just doesn't feel great to use. The Burt is good at keeping you safe if you aren't, using one of your primaries. And if you are using, an autocannon build that takes a second to kind of get up and running, get up to top speed, as it were, it can be nice to switch to the Burt and clear bugs off of you so that you have a safe place to reload or get up to max firing speed as quickly as possible. In addition, I do think that electro minelets for the Burt is pretty good, but otherwise, it's kind of mid. Every time I take it, I'm just underwhelmed by it. Not in a way where I'll never take it again. I have a few builds that use it, but in a way that leaves me feeling kind of hollow and sad inside. Next up, we have the coil gun, and of course, the coil gun is a great alternative. And I think the coil gun is most interesting for the fact that this is a very overclock dependent weapon. Not in terms of being good, it's fine on its own, but in terms of depending on which of the, I would argue, two biggest overclocks you take, it can radically change how it works. Um, Historically, I've leaned towards the overclock known as the Mole, which allows you to deal a ton of single target damage. I mean, you can hit multiple people with it, but it's really designed for you to mark a high value target, duck behind a wall, and deal a ton of bonus damage to the enemy. It's pretty good. It's very solid across the board for that role. I often take it into missions against dreadnoughts, or if I think there's going to be, you know, not if there's going to be, but if we are going to, as a team, struggle against oppressors or something, I'll often run the Mole. And the Mole, it works really good as well with Burning Hell, or like Rocket Barrage, or not Rocket Barrage, sorry, Cluster, fuck, whatever the, sorry, Cluster Charges for the Hurricane. I can never remember that one for some reason. You know, any build that pins the gunner's primary into being like big AoE damage, the Mole's pretty good with. The other option, though, is Hellfire for the coil gun, and Hellfire is very, very, very powerful. Not only does it light enemies on fire when they are within the beam of the coil gun, but it doesn't have significant weaknesses for the gun itself, so you're still good at dealing with single targets. You just also have better AoE area denial, which can be really helpful. I run Hellfire on my mortar rounds build for the autocannon because it helps keep babies from eating me alive, and I'm a big fan of not being eaten alive, believe it or not. Controversial, I know. But that's the gunner for you in a nutshell. And next up we have the Scout. And the Scout starts with the Deep Core GK2. And this is, I don't know why I put it in best in slot. Sorry, I meant to put it here. This is a great alternative. I think that the GK2, so many people just had a fucking heart attack that I put this in best in slot. I'm sorry for the jump scare. GK2 is great, don't get me wrong. GK2 has several very good overclocks as well as several builds. The most notable that I'm going to mention here is Bullets of Mercy. Bullets of Mercy is great, especially when you are running in a team with a driller who can apply all of the statuses in the known universe. That's a joke, but he can apply quite a few very easily by existing, and the GK2 gets bonus damage from that. Very solid stuff. It is a reliable, consistent weapon that you will never regret having on you. But, there is another. And it's the M1000. It's best in slot. This is the one that goes up here. This is the gun that a lot of people argue is the best gun in the game. I don't agree. I don't think you can really compare the guns across classes, etc., etc. But it's good. M1000 is very good. It does what the Scout wants to do most, which is eliminate high-value targets. It does that better than any of the other guns that the Scout has, really. It's just great. It has multiple good and or fun overclocks. For instance, I run hoverclock on it a lot because I think it's really fun. I don't think it's very good necessarily, but I think it's a lot of fun. There's also hipster, which is a controversial overclock, and by simply saying my opinion on it, I may be assassinated by certain people on YouTube who absolutely suck off the hipster every single night, but I think it's only okay. I think it's fine. I don't really like using it personally, though. I'm sorry. The newest overclock, even, that was released for the M1000, marked for death, is awesome. It's weird, and it's awesome. It was ripped directly out of TF2, rest in peace, brothers, but it's still great. Overall, M1000, it's got a ton of different builds. It's got a ton you can do with it. It's always good at eliminating high-value targets. You can build into the hipster overclock to be a little bit better at kind of like wave clear and stuff. It's just great. It just does everything the scout wants to do, and then gives you some bonuses on top of that. Plus, it makes a cool ding noise. A lot of people like that, so good on you, I guess. Finally, for primaries, we have the Drac. Okay, there we go. I stretched the tier list so you guys can see where the Drac is. So the Drac is kind of weak. I mean, it's not so weak it's unusable, but it's kind of mid across the board. It's supposed to be kind of the wave clear option for the Scout, in my opinion. That kind of seems to be the best way to play around with it up until the most recent season. But that's not really what Scout excels at. I like running the Drac when I play by myself because I like the overheating mechanic you can do with it in a similar way to the Burning Hell build that I run on the minigun, basically. But yeah, it's kind of mid. I think that the newest overclock for it is it's good in teams and in organized play. What's it called? Conductive thermals, yeah. Basically, it allows you to burn and freeze enemies more quickly when the Drac is shooting stuff. So you can even do things like light dreadnoughts on fire because you can essentially lower their resistance down to a point where they can actually be lit on fire, which is interesting. Makes it easier to freeze things. Good synergy with the driller class in general, but also kind of nice to have for things like, various minigun builds or shard diffractor builds. It's very viable across the board. It even buffs electric damage, I should note that, so even the stubby gets in on this shit. Let's fucking go. Representation for my boy down in the mid tier. But overall, I think the Drac is kind of meh. I have never been that impressed with the Drac, generally speaking. I think it's very mid to me. But let's talk about a weapon that I do not consider to be mid, and that is the jury-rigged boomstick, going straight into great alternative because this shit's fun as fuck. It's also quite good. The only overclock I'm going to talk about here is special powder, because it lets you shotgun jump, and that's awesome, okay? In general, the jury-rigged boomstick is a solid alternative to the, best in slot option for the Scout as a secondary weapon. It gives you a degree of safety that other secondaries for the Scout don't really give you. You can easily wipe out a pretty sizable group of bugs who run up on you with it, and it even has a mod that applies part of the damage that it deals as fire, which allows you to light enemies on fire, which is always a good thing. Generally, I think the jury-rigged boomstick is quite good. Its overclocks are kind of a mixed bag in that I don't think most of them are all that crazy fun, personally. However, it does have double barrel, which is very fun, and it has special powder, which is insanely fun. If you are playing with a team and you are full-on resource boy, you don't even shoot bugs unless they happen to be in your way, I recommend special powder. I recommend jury-rigged boomstick. It gives you so much flexibility and movement through the caves. I can't live without it half the time. I just love it so much because it's so fun. Overall, though, there is a better alternative in the secondary slot, don't get me wrong, but I can't move it down any further than that. I love that thing. Next up is the Zhukovs, which go down here in mid. Zhukovs are, I think, kind of weak baseline because they don't really give you a whole lot of defense compared to the jury-rigged boomstick, and they don't give you the utility of the crossbow that we'll be getting to here in a few moments. I think it's also pretty reliant on overclocks. Namely, I think embedded detonators is quite good. Embedded detonators can do a ton of damage from the Zhukovs. It's actually wild how much damage they will do. If you mark a dreadnought for death and pump it full of lead with these and then reload, it takes like fucking, like a fifth of its HP? It's a lot. Probably not that much, but it is a sizable chunk. Cryo minelets are also quite good on the Zhukovs. They do give you a degree of safety. You basically just shoot at your feet when enemies are running at you, and at least some of them will get frozen by it. It's pretty good. I used to run a hipster with Zhukov cryo minelets build, and yeah, it was good. It was fun. I don't do it anymore because I am addicted to the special powder lifestyle now, but I like the build. I just think the Zhukov suffer from not having a ton of variety and being like just not really stacking up compared to the other two options that are available as scout secondaries. And the obvious top dog is the crossbow. It's great. The damage is surprisingly good with it, but you're not here for the damage, you're here for the special bolts. It has tons of variety. I don't even really know enough about the crossbow to have a strong build for you guys necessarily. I build around the pheromone darts and just kind of live my life like that. So I can't really say a whole lot else on that particular element of it, but I will say that in terms of fitting in with the play style of Scout in group play at higher Haz levels, nothing really beats out the crossbow, because your job as a Scout is to be assassinating high value targets, collecting resources, and being a little bit disruptive to the bugs. To that end, the crossbow bolt allowing you to smack bugs with pheromone bolts, pretty strong, obviously. But in addition, it can also burn and freeze enemies. I think there's even an electric one, isn't there? So it can do a little bit of everything. It even has a fear tied to it. It's just everything. Everything you could ever want tied to the crossbow bolts. It's fantastic. I ran a clean overclock for quite a while, playing at Haz 5 and 5.5, because is the specialist? Yeah, the specialist clean overclock gives you more special ammo and makes your special effects last longer, and I was like, good enough for me. That's all I need it for. So, pretty solid option. Real 10 out of 10 kind of deal. But that's it for the tier list. That's it for the weapons. Soak it in, guys. This is it. Again, I have to stress here at the very end, all of these weapons are good, all of them are usable. You may have noticed that a lot of my favorites are hovering down here, not necessarily in the best in slot category, except of course the minigun, my beloved. But by and large, I mostly play with these weapons down here on higher Haz difficulties, and I don't really struggle very much. At that point, it's all about build more than anything, and to an extent, overclocks. So, to that end, we are going to have a little bit of a fun tier list next time. I'll be releasing that early next week. But after that, we will be doing the overclock tier list. Technically, part 1. We will start probably with Driller or Engineer, and then kind of go from there. But it will be a 4-part series, because I will try to cover each of the overclocks as best I can, right? In a little bit of detail. I skimmed it here. It's impossible to talk about weapons without talking about the overclocks, but I will go into a lot more detail at that time. But thank you guys for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you guys agree with me or disagree with me, let me know down in the comments. Really appreciating the discussion that has come out of these videos. It's been a lot of fun seeing how people feel about things. Lots of people out here really going to bat for the friendly perk. You'll love to see it. So maybe some people will give me some input on my mid-alternative tier, and maybe I missed something on one of those weapons that makes it a secret sleeper pick that's actually busted. And yes, I know about neurotoxin. I know it's there. I've played with it, it's fine. You don't have to tell me that one. Comment anything except neurotoxin payload, please, for the love of God. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. I will be making more. Any kind of engagement really helps the channel, and I really appreciate that. And also, it really helps me know what people want to see and what they are enjoying. So, like I said, Thank you guys so much. Have a good one. Peace.